Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, welcome to the ATP Virtual Conference, Innovations and Testing Conference. Today our topic is maximizing your job analysis options and opportunities. What we want to do today is take you through this journey with my two fellow panelists on what does the job analysis look today, what did it look like in the past, and what does it look like in the future, so we can look at how we can maximize all those opportunities and options for your credentialing program. So joining me today is Lavina and Jared, and unfortunately, Raleigh could not join us today. She, given the limitations of the presentation today, we only are limited to 3 folks, so she volunteered to step out. So we did want to honor her presence here and her contributions to this prior to it being virtual. So thank you very much, Raleigh, and if Lavina, you could introduce yourself, that would be great.
Hey there, my name is Lavina Harlis. I'm the Exam Development Director at the Association of Social Work Boards. We do the licensing exam for social workers across the U.S. and in Canada. Last year, we gave over 55,000 exams.
Thank you, Lavina. And Jared?
Hello all, my name is Jared Zern. I'm the Vice President of Examination for the National Council of Architectural Registration Boards, and we do the licensure exam for architects across the United States.
Thank you. And I'm Manny Straley. I'm founder and president of Assessment Education Research Experts. We're a small consulting firm located in Savannah. We do a lot of test development, psychometrics, accreditation, consultation. So if you want a job analysis, standard setting, or anything in that, that's what we do. We also do competency modeling as well. So I'm going to move this forward and start talking about the job analysis. So what I want to ask the panelists is, where are they right now? Lavina and Jared, where are you right now in terms of your job analysis cycle, and how are you thinking about it? Why don't we start with Jared, if you could tell us more about that.
Well, so Manny, we right now are actually right in the middle of that leap that you see on screen. So we had started working on the next research effort around a job task analysis as COVID hit. And because of the disruption of COVID, we actually paused our project because we didn't want the data to become skewed based on the shutdown of the economy that was taking place and things like that. So I literally right now am frozen in time, just like this image.
Okay, Lavina, where were you at?
So our last practice analysis was completed in 2016, and our exams based on those new blueprints were launched in 2018. So we have 2 full years of data on the new exams, and we're monitoring performance of that, which has gone great. And of course, we're evaluating the possibilities and potentials for our next practice analysis, which will begin again in 2021, 2022. So always a cycle.
Thank you so much. So, you know, I'm sort of all over the place when it comes to job analysis because I'm looking at what my clients' needs are. So, you know, in some cases, I'm making that leap and trying to introduce things, and it's getting more, you know, it gets more complicated, especially if it's more of a performance assessment or more of a competency level. Looking at various performance levels, like going from very beginner to all the way to that mastery expert level. So there's different sort of scopes and things like that. There's certainly different needs that are out there as well. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. Sometimes I'm doing a job analysis just for a specific job to come up with a job description, which is more of an IO function, industrial organizational function. And most of the time I'm doing, you know, the job analysis for a credentialing examination, which is very specific, has a specific scope and purpose. And the more mature they are, the more routine it becomes. So you're not taking much of a leap, but you're actually validating things that meet all those psychometric requirements and things like that. So that's something to keep in mind. So I'm sometimes taking the leap, sometimes I'm staring at the stream, sometimes, I'm underwater for things that I'm not quite sure where people want to go, because there's a lot of ways to measure competency. Someone says, hey, can we just look at like
Mhm.
what the neuro assessment results look like for someone who's a mastery violin player? I'm like, well, I never really did that. I read about it. I don't know how to do that. You get a functional MRI or something like that. So, and look at those results, and perhaps that would be the results you would have to look at, and you compare someone that way in terms of your assessment. So that's a whole different, that's more of the future, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. So I want to move forward. Um, so, there's a long history here of what the job analysis is and where it began. And just to briefly go over that, back in the day, about 1,000 years ago, the Chinese government really was looking at how do you select government officials, and they had to do something that's very common to what we do today, is to describe what someone does. And in this exam, there was writing, arithmetic, music, horsemanship, master of ceremonies, and rites, and things like that. So there were different areas to focus on. And then if you fast forward to more modern day stuff, the French government in the 1700s created all these occupation descriptions, encyclopedias, and things like that. And if you fast forward a little further, in the US, we had scientific management with Taylor and other folks that come up with the job analysis. And it was really, again, to describe what someone does at work. And those descriptions are based upon different units or different ways of describing it. They could be tasks, what you do, they could be knowledges, and we'll get into that a little bit more. They could be even personality, attitudes, aptitudes, skills, so all sorts of things. Sometimes we call them KSAOs, knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics. So this became really important in World War I and World War II with the military and placing the right people at the right place. This became more and more important as the Department of Labor evolved in the early 1900s in World War II, and ONET and Dictionary Occupational Titles, where we're all born. And these were just, again, listing job characteristics, and that's not a lot of that has changed over time. And what you'll find is the common characteristics. What the history has taught us is we're really trying to figure out what are the things that people do and those characteristics, and at some specific level. And then a lot of different groups use it for different things. Sometimes it's just used to come up with a job description. Sometimes it's to come up with ensuring that someone's qualified at the job. So if we move to what today is really what, in terms of coming up with a credentialing examination, this is what we do. We look at what you do and what you need to know to do it. And at the other end of it is all these sort of ways of looking at the job and describing it at some performance level and things like that. So that's really what we're doing today. And the next slide really gets into how do you do it for credentialing, which is, we have a list of tasks, what you do, what you need to know to do it. Those are your knowledges. And then you have your test specifications that come up with what areas should be tested on. There's a number of research methods that you use, surveys, subject matter experts, focus groups, sometimes you use literature reviews, things like that, and all sorts of things. You do observational studies and things like that. So what does it look like, the entire process, the common process? And if you look at the common process today, it's really what we're doing is we're looking at the drafting the initial statements, which are the task and knowledge statements, looking at the task force to come up with those information. That's a group of subject matter experts. Then we put together a survey, and a bunch of subject matter experts, typically those who are certified or have equivalent abilities, take the survey. And then what you do is you assess the results, and typically it's on a bunch of rating scales are used against those task statements, like importance, criticality, frequencies, acquisition of the job. There's a number of rating scales you could use, but typically importance, criticality, and frequency are used a lot or almost always. And then what we do is we come up with, okay, what should be included based upon the results, and then we look at different sort of weightings across all these areas like algebra and And trigonometry, we could look at 40% in algebra and 60% in trigonometry. And then what happens is we use that to come up with an exam, and then we set up a passing score around it. And that's how we qualify someone around certain areas that they can do something in a certain area. So a lot of times this does result in a lot of different emotions. You could be happy, some folks are sad. Some of my clients do have a display of this depending upon how they want to use the job analysis. If you are creative with your job analysis, there's a lot of things you can do with it. It serves as an input for a lot of things, aligning your education, aligning all sorts of things, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But there's a lot of reactions, and I think it's, you have to think beyond just using it for an examination. Even though that wasn't the specific reason, you created a job analysis. So I'm really curious, what my panelists have done about their past and where they're going today, because I think this is where it really, really gets interesting. So let's hear from them. So we'll begin with Lavina.
Thank you so much, Manny. So in terms of the practicalities really of the process, our practice analysis evolution really probably isn't that much different from the rest of you folks. We've conducted practice analyses every 7 years since the 1980s. And since that time, again, we've moved through usual changes of the mailed surveys to links for folks to respond to, and then of course most recently a fully online experience. And really our important changes over time for us, really it has had to do with more of how we approached the execution and oversight of the project. Earlier in our analyses, there was much more inwardly driven, and committees, the practice analysis task force and such, were drawn from our insiders and known quantities within the organization. So most of the people who are familiar with the organization and some regulators as well. And over time, we've begun soliciting participation, of course, from social workers who have no direct involvement with ASWB at all, or social work regulation really as a whole, so they don't know much about it. And at the same time, we've balanced that approach of bringing in folks who really don't know what's happening with an oversight panel of people who have been around for a while to help guide that process. And they have a little bit more direct experience on the exams, working on the exams themselves. And so really that change has allowed us to become more inclusive, and it's become an entry point for folks to be involved in the future of the program throughout different facets of an exam development. So at present, many of the people we just trained as item writers were also members of the practice analysis task force in 2016 and 2017. So that is our hope, that they can continue through the program and eventually become exam committee members. And then, of course, the most important thing is being ambassadors for the exam and for the program, and having that buy-in. And also, some of these folks getting interested in the exam first, they've also become interested in regulation and have become appointed to their social work regulatory boards in their jurisdictions. So again, just a great way to get folks involved and interested in what the protection of the public mission looks like.
So thank you, Lavina. There's a lot of options and opportunities for the subject matter experts. So I'm really curious where Jared is in all of this.
So Manny, thank you. Our history, I'm starting in 1997, which was when NCARB switched to computer-based testing. And the first big job analysis after that was 2001. And that was a really big job analysis for NCARB at the time, where they wanted to move beyond just figuring out the knowledge and skills. And they really expanded into, how does this profession really interact with other professions, code officials, engineers? And you do that as part of your job task analysis typically, but really more from a marketing perspective and more from a demographics perspective. So back in 2001, those were some key things we really, as an organization, wanted to learn more about, is understanding relationships and seeing how those relationships can be leveraged from a marketing perspective. The other part was the demographics. Just, who are all of these architects that are out there and what do they really represent in society? So we learned a lot in 2001, caused us to evolve our exam in the 2007 timeframe. And then our latest practice analysis was done in 2012. And in 2012, we went back out with a couple more ideas behind it. So not only touching on demographics and learning even more, because we wanted to see if the demographics of the profession are changing, but we also approach it from a little bit more of an advocacy perspective and a thought leadership perspective. You had mentioned earlier sort of tying it into education. And prior to 2012, it was always do the job analysis to think about the exam. And then in 2012, it said, no, let's do the job analysis. Let's certainly think about the exam, but what about education? And honestly, what about continuing education even after somebody earns that license? So 2012 was a much broader scope, really across the whole life cycle of the profession. And then we launched a new exam in 2016 based off that data. And as I said earlier, we're just waiting to get going again on our next one after this lovely COVID-19 disruption.
So thanks, Jared. And what's really interesting is if you look at some of the groups that have been credentialing for a long, long time, like medicine and legal areas, there are specialties that emerge from looking at the demographics. There could be, just think of medicine, there's the emergency doctor, and then there's just the general practitioner. And the general practitioner has been taking that credential for a long, long time, and then, just evolved into just coming up with an emergency physician specialty. So this could create your stackable model in terms of a horizontal across the specialties, and you could create always the verticals across your competency levels. So again, there's a lot of options for SMEs. There's a lot of options to look at your demographics and have different offerings, or across your educational material. So moving on, what we like to do is play a little, because virtual is a little stale sometimes versus in person. So this was really done for in person. So what we like to do is to think about what we talked about already and come up with a forward story about your job analysis. And some of the examples here are, the ice cracked loudly. That could describe something that happened, today in your life. The questioning finally stopped. Peace returned once again. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask my panelists. We'll ask Jared first to describe your forward story.
Certainly. So the way NCARB is going into this next job analysis is our forward story is they embraced uncertain conclusions. And that is truly where NCARB is at right now. Knowing that technology is really driving changes inside of the industry, artificial intelligence, machine learning, demands on education and people's ability to even get an education has all created a lot of uncertainty. And we're willing to go into this without any pre-baked conclusions, and we really do want to peel back the layers and just see what we can discover. And I think that's a great opportunity when you go into a job analysis is don't have a bunch of insiders like Lavina talked about, because a bunch of insiders probably already have the solution in mind and they just want you to validate it. Whereas we're actually taking a very different approach, which is we don't have a clue what's really going on and we want to try to help understand it.
Thank you, Jared. Let's move on to Lavina's forward story. It's really interesting, these forward stories.
Thank you, Manny. And of course, not surprisingly, the social work forward story is building an invested community. Again, clearly the practice analysis is the foundation on which we build our exam, but we view this process as part of a larger whole. And we try to maintain connections with our volunteers. We recruit very diverse professionals to participate in our processes, and we keep them involved and encourage them to become further involved with the program, so we can increase our community of folks who understand and appreciate the value of the licensing exams. And to a large extent, at least in part, the degree to which the profession really sees itself as a whole and the level of attachment that professionals have with the idea is going to determine the success of a practice analysis. And I think our challenge in social work is that we don't see ourselves as a regulated profession. Not all social workers are licensed. So, that challenge is definitely there, and one that when we undertake our next practice analysis, we need to think creatively about that and maybe not necessarily just survey the people who are licensed, and figure out, are folks actually doing something different? Is there a way we could leverage another certification from this, possibly for folks who are performing some of these tasks but maybe aren't educated the way we think they should be educated in order to be licensed? Maybe there's a credential there that we could do. So of course there's that piece. So we want that professional identity and folks to buy in terms of licensing and regulation. But then we have the issue of folks being so distracted all the time by everything. And we're going to have to figure out how to get really creative and how to kind of reach all of these folks and do it in a way that speaks to our values as social workers. So it's going to be a very interesting next practice analysis, I suspect, where we are trying to unite the profession. There have been many stressors on our profession, and we have, come to the forefront right now through the Black Lives Matter movement, some of the social work and policing, those kinds of pieces that, we want to make sure that we're being responsive to through this next practice analysis.
Well, thank you, Lavina.
Mm-hmm.
So when I look at it, there's still a lot of folks doing things that they can be doing, as Jared and Lavina have said. One of the things that is coming up, I should say, is diversity and inclusion as a domain now to add into your job analysis. And one of the things you might want to do is say, well, the debate is that a professional sort of area, or is that should be on the examination? So those are conversations you need to look at. But the bigger picture is, you have a job analysis is telling you what somebody should be doing in their job and what they should know, a characterization of who they are as a professional. It's their identity. So there's a lot of things that you can insert someone's identity into, such as education. So there's also your competency model. You could create products and services in terms of a stackable credential where you're looking at, okay, I'm an IT professional. Well, maybe you're an IT professional that has some business experiences, so that would be a horizontal stack. Or maybe you're an IT professional that wants to be more advanced, so that's a vertical stack. You go beginner, intermediate, advanced. There's a lot of alternative cognitive models than just Bloom. There's Weber. There's all sorts of folks out there that are doing some really interesting work in that. There's, going back to George Miller is a really classic model on that. So there are things that folks are not really implementing and really looking at. And again, you have to come back to the main question to look at what options you want to explore. And that main question is your strategy. What's your scope? What's the legibility criteria? What do you want this person to do at the end of the day? The job analysis tends to exist for the credential, but at the end of the day, it's more to it. As Jared once said when we did this, I think last year, this presentation, take your job analysis off that bookshelf and use it for a lot of different things. So it's something that I've thought about a lot since he made that statement. So it's something that you should be thinking about as well. Moving on, looking at, today's, I'm really going to the future here. So looking at, today's models of what you have and what's going on, there's so many different ways to do a job analysis. But a lot of these things that you see here are been around for many, many years. There's the functional job analysis that has a certain way of doing a job analysis, and there's a position questionnaire that really is looking at different sort of things that happen in terms of 195 questions. It's standardized. Then there's like the task inventories is something that a lot of us use in terms of trying to put a list of tasks together. Then there's the Daca model that a lot of folks have used in our industry, and that's really around facilitation to get, the list of task and knowledge statements and other characteristics. There's the time and motion studies, which are interesting. That's like if you ever see the McDonald's brothers, the McDonald's food chain, when you ever see that movie, they're like looking at how quickly they could look at stations and making the hamburgers and fast food items more quickly and more efficiently and cost effectively. So there's a lot of sort of things, we use like a lot of ETS-based methods. We're looking at other folks talking about it. And to be honest, there's not a lot of new literature out there on competency modeling and job analysis. And there's actually an article that talks about that. In the 70s and 80s, there were so many, a lot of literature coming out in our field on it. So something I think, that the psychometric and measurement community need to look at. There's actually more coming around from evaluation and things like that. So you want to go beyond your current way of thinking as well. There's neuroassessments. It's not even on here. And I think sometimes that's the future because of actually assessing folks. So then you look at baselining people's brain scans and brain functions and things like that. So that's really interesting. And there's been some research on that already. So, and it's moving more and more in that direction as we get more accurate. So, one of the things I do want to ask and want you to all think about at home or wherever you're seeing this from your offices, your virtual offices, what do you think the future holds for the job analysis and what do you want from the future? So I'm going to ask that question and I'm going to give you sort of my sort of model already. I mean, there's a lot of methods that are going to come that's going to be new, like the neuroassessment methods and things like that. There's going to be different ways of looking at the outcomes of these competencies. How do you know someone can function? It's one of the limitations of a job analysis, but it's one of the things that a competency model explores. So if someone, for instance, is able to conduct patient safety evaluations, does that mean that they're going to save money for the hospital? Does that mean they're going to make more money? Does that mean they're going to have better patient satisfaction numbers? So every task or knowledge statement or any competency building block should have an outcome related to it. So these are some things to think about. So what will the competencies look like in the future for job analysis or other sort of things? We do focus on it, but we don't focus on it. Personality, sometimes it comes back, sometimes it doesn't. It doesn't really trend in the psychometric community as much as it does in the clinical community of trying to predict folks' competencies just through personalities. There's a lot of literature on that out there already. So the future is going to be very interesting as, with technological capabilities and AI and ways of measuring humans differently than just, an examination to look at their competency. So these things will be very, very interesting as we move in time. So I'm just curious, where Jared and Lavina are thinking about this, and if we want to go over to Lavina and talk about it, that'd be great.
Thanks, Manny. So I have a couple of things that I'm hoping for in the future relative to the social work exams. And the first thing is that the social work profession embraces its identity as a licensed profession into the future. And even while it continues to embrace and promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. And our professional identity is really the key to ensuring that the profession understands the practice analysis process and will contribute to that. And the second thing is that we continue to build our internal community in ways that reflect the profession's values, and we foster investment in the exam development process through doing that. And as we create this community, of course, we not only strengthen our processes by doing this, but we build this growing number of professionals who have this firsthand appreciation of what we do and can communicate this outside of our organization. So we get buy-in from those folks. And then we view all of those folks, our volunteers, as ambassadors for the exams, which really helps us communicate that messaging about the exams and the practice analysis in particular, and how they are really critical components in the viability of the profession's continued existence. So thanks.
So thank you, Lavina. And we're going to move on to Jared in the interest of time here.
So Manny, the future of architecture is one where we're really trying to not be this, right? You look at this image, this is that lovely image from the Matrix where, right, the bad guy is everywhere, he's taken over everybody. And the reality is in architecture right now, people tend to think about architects like this, that every architect's exactly the same. Instead of embracing how diverse this profession really is, and diverse from the aspects of not only who the individuals are, but the work they do and how they do the work. And so right now, we sort of function in a licensure model, which is a one-size-fits-all, but that does not embrace the reality of the profession, and it doesn't embrace the reality of society. And so that's really the challenge, I think, in the future is how do we build licensure models that can serve the pathways, the many, many pathways coming into the profession, and the many, many outcomes that come out of that license. And so it's not this. This is my worst possible case image, and I wanted to scare people with.
Thank you, Jared. It can be really scary to sort of, create clones essentially. So thank you for both my panelists, both Lavina and Jared, and Raleigh is unfortunately not here to join us today. So one of the things you want to think about is as you process what has occurred today and what we talked about, think about what questions to ask in our upcoming Q&A session in September for this live Q&A session to ask us. Hopefully all of us will be able to join. We look forward to your questions and talking to you. You can always reach out to us via email or LinkedIn or anything like that. We definitely would answer any of your questions. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you, my panelists today. I hope you all have a great day, and thank you again.
Well, maybe